Hey everyone, it's Megan here from Meghan Makes Do, and today I'm going to show you how to seam and make and add your pockets to your beacon bomber. Okay, so we finished our front panels and our back panel, and we're going to lay them out so that the shoulder seams are going to be together. And what we're going to do is we're going to just be seaming over however many inches is indicated for your size. So since I'm working on the 2X, I'm going to be seaming over about 10 inches only. So you're going to have some extra part of the front panels not seamed together, and you'll have between 8 and 10 inches on your back panel that's unworked. So I'm going to get my tapestry needle and get a little bit closer up, and I'll show you how I like to seam my shoulders together. Okay, so I'm grabbing my blunt tapestry needle here and using the long tail on the front panel, we're going to be seaming the shoulders. I like to seam with the right side facing up, so I know it's kind of personal preference. If you want to do wrong side up, that's fine too. And then you can use whatever seaming method you prefer. I like to do the mattress stitch. And then I know it can be a little bit hard to see the stitches with this yarn, so just do the best that you can. But the mattress stitch, we're basically be working from the inside going out through the tops of the stitches. So here's the first stitch on the back panel. I'm going to go from the inside out, and then through the first stitch on the front panel from the inside out, and then through the second stitch on the back panel from the inside out, and through the second stitch on the front from the inside out. So just keep zigzagging back and forth, seaming these panels together. Now, since I'm doing the size 2X, I know that I'm going to want to seam 10 inches across, which comes out to be 33 stitches. So you can count that way by counting the number of stitches that you'll need to get that amount of inches. So if you look in the pattern, you should be able to see for your size how many stitches you need to seam across, so that you're leaving that little gap and opening for your neckline where we'll put the collar. So I believe this is stitch 5. But we're just going to seam the shoulders together however many inches across, from working from the outside in as best you can. Luckily this yarn is very forgiving, so you can see this is what it will look like on the other side. So whichever side you prefer to seam on is totally fine and up to you, and whichever method you prefer is good as well. So let's go ahead and we'll finish seaming our shoulder seams, again following along with the written pattern so you know exactly how much to seam for each shoulder. And once we have those shoulders together, I'll show you what it looks like, and then we'll go ahead and seam the sleeves. Okay, so once you have your shoulders seamed across, this is what it will look like. So if we fold those little extra bits on the front panel over, you can double check and measure across here, but you should have between 8 and 10 inches unseamed on the back panel. So now what we're going to do is we're going to open up one of the sides here, and we're going to align the center of our shoulder seam with the center of our sleeve, and seam the sleeve to the back and front panels right along this edge here. Okay, so you can see here, this is our back panel, front panel, sleeve. So I've found the center of the sleeve, and I've put a stitch marker through the center stitch of the sleeve and through the shoulder seam on the front and back panels. So then we just want to measure down however long our half of our sleeve width should be, our armhole depth basically. So this one, I want to have about 9 inches down, which we might have to stretch our sleeve a little bit along the edges. But we want to kind of line those up as best we can. So I'm going to pin those down with another stitch marker using my tape measure to measure from the center all the way down here. It's a little tricky to do one-handed here, but you can see I might have to stretch my sleeve a little bit just to hit that 9-inch mark, but I can kind of pull it down and stretch to where it needs to be. And then we're going to start at the center for seaming, and we're going to seam from the center down the back panel, and then from the center down the front panel to get our sleeve attached to our front and back panels. Okay, so I've cut a long piece of yarn and I'm using my tapestry needle, and we're going to start here in the center. So through, let's see, from the inside out through our center stitch here. And what I like to do is I like to cut a very long piece of yarn, and then I kind of split it in half. So half of the long piece is going to go one way, and half of the long piece is going to go the other way down the sleeve. I find it best to kind of seam from the middle over, so that way we're making sure we're hitting our two measurement points here. So since I'm making the 2X, I want my armhole depth to be 9 inches. So I want 9 inches from the center down the back and 9 inches from the center down the front. So depending on what size you are making, that's how many inches you'll need to go. But using this long piece of yarn, I think tends to help. So about half of it, I'll kind of adjust here. We want half on one side and half on the other. Okay, so this tail is going to go down the front panel, and this one will go down the back. Pull a little bit more so it's a little even. Okay. So then we're going to use this end. I'm going to go through our shoulder seam. Again, I like to use kind of like a mattress style stitch of seaming here. So always going from the center of our seam out and just zigzagging back and forth. All the way down the back panel. And just kind of keeping in mind, making sure we're keeping this line nice and straight so that we're not getting any bunches or pulls, and we're evenly seaming the sleeve to the back part of our bomber jacket. And like I said before, this yarn is very forgiving, so you hopefully won't see your seam very much in the end, since all the fuzzy chenille pieces kind of hide that seam a little bit for us. So just take your time, kind of readjusting as you go, making sure we're keeping that line nice and straight. We're not getting, you know, bunched up like this or anything. And we're just going to continue to seam down the back panel. And then once we get to our blue stitch marker, we will pick up the other side of this long piece of yarn and attach our sleeve to the front panel. Okay, so we're almost to the end here of the back panel and the sleeve attachment. So go ahead and take this stitch marker out. Just Just make sure we get this nice and attached here. Okay, and then I'm just going to leave this tail here because we could use it to seam down the sides or down the armhole when we're all done. So now we're going to move back over to the center, and we're going to pick up the other side of that long tail of yarn and rethread our tapestry needle with that. And this time we're going to be working from the center of the armhole and shoulder seam down the other side, down the front panel. Okay, so we can remove this center stitch marker. And again, same as before, moving from the inside of the seam out. Working back and forth, kind of in a zigzag pattern. Or again, you can use whichever seaming method you prefer. I know sometimes with this kind of fuzzy yarn, it can be hard to see the stitches and might be more difficult. Sometimes this yarn will tend to kind of start to lose the chenille and you might end up with a very thin piece of string. So if you're having trouble, you could also just slip stitch your seams together on the wrong side. Totally up to you, whatever you prefer, whatever you're most comfortable with. But we're just going to continue to seam down this side of the arm and the front panel. And then we will fold our bomber jacket in half, and then we can seam down the arm and down the side. Okay, so I've folded our cardigan in half, or our bomber jacket in half. So here's the sleeve. So what we want to do is bring like the armpits, like the sleeve seam together into the armpit. And I'm going to use some stitch markers to kind of pin it together all the way down to the cuff. And then we'll seam the arm, and then we'll start here again in the armpit and go all the way down to the bottom to seam the side. So what I like to do is kind of get these in line here and just kind of put a stitch marker every few rows, just so I can make sure I'm keeping it in line all the way down my sleeve, and then to the cuff here, getting the edges of the cuff in line as well. And then just make sure you're going through both sides of the sleeve. So we're basically kind of just pinning it in place here. Okay. That should be plenty. And then I have these long tails still from when I seamed the arm to the body. So I think I can just try to use these as my yarn for seaming. If you don't have enough, that's fine. You can just cut a new piece and kind of join here. And again, I'm going to be using my blunt tapestry needle and a mattress stitch to go from the armpit down to the cuff. So let's make sure we have our other pieces of yarn out of the way. This one, let's see, come over a little bit here. All right, so we're gonna go from the inside out, joining the two sides of our arm, of our sleeve together. And And again, if you prefer a different method of seaming, that's totally fine. Whichever method you're most comfortable with will work. We just want to make sure that we're keeping it in line, trying our best to kind of get those rows in line. So if it helps to kind of open up and hold it more like this while you seam, you can do that. And then having these stitch markers in place, we can kind of tug on them and make sure that our seam is staying nice and straight. So we're going to seam all the way down the sleeve until we get to the cuff. And then I'm going to try to use the tails I have here, or cutting a piece of basic stitch and using color B, which is the basic stitch. I'm going to seam using that yarn instead of using the chenille yarn. But go ahead and continue seaming down, and then when I get to the cuff, I'll show you kind of how I switch yarns and seam that section. Alright, so we've seamed all the way down through the chenille peel yarn, so I'm going to take that off my needle and pick up this tail end of the basic stitch anti-pilling. Move my tails out of the way. Take this stitch marker out, and now we're just going to be seaming with the basic stitch. Again, going back and forth. Again, if you prefer doing a different method, that's totally okay. Oops, snagged a little bit. But we can just easily switch to the other yarn for seaming the cuffs. So we'll seam it all the way down to the end here. And then we can take all of our tails and kind of weave those in when we are done. Kind of just a short little tail end here, going through those last two stitches. Okay, so now we can weave in all of the ends here, and then we're going to go back up to our armpit. Our stitch marker, I left this one in, and we're going to do the same thing going down the side of our bomber. So again, we can use our stitch markers to hold everything in place. And here I still have a little bit of a longer tail for the basic stitch anti-pilling to do this bottom ribbing part. But I'm just gonna do the same thing. So we're gonna pin using our stitch markers all the way along the edge to hold everything in place. And then using one of my tail ends or a new piece of yarn, depending on what you have left, we're just going to be seaming all the way down the side, starting at the armpit and working down through the ribbing. And then you'll just repeat that process. So going down the arm and going down the side on the other side of your bomber jacket. And then we will be done with the seaming so far. Okay, so moving on to the pockets. If you follow along with the written instructions, you'll see that for the beginning of both pockets, we're just gonna be making these rectangles of extended single crochet. So depending on what size you're making will depend on how many stitches across and how many rows high this initial section needs to be. Then for both pockets, you move into a decrease section. So the side that you're decreasing on will depend on what pocket you're making. So for the left pocket, that's the pocket that's going to be on us when we're wearing the bomber jacket on the left side, and we're going to be decreasing on the right side of the pocket as it, or no, sorry, the right side of the pocket as we look at it. For the right side pocket, we'll decrease on the left-hand side of the pocket. So I know it's opposite. It'll make sense once you see both pockets together at the same time, why one side decreases on one and one decreases on the other. So you're basically making mirror images of each other. So I'm just going to go over the basics of the decrease section. So either on the left or right side of the pocket, when it's facing you, you'll do decrease rows. Every row you'll decrease on the same edge, and you'll be creating this diagonal line, and that's where your hand will enter the pocket. So we will be doing the left side pocket, and so to start we're going to chain one and turn, and so we'll be doing decreases only on this edge, okay, so the right hand side, and we're just going to skip one stitch, and then we're going to extended single crochet in each stitch all the way across. So that's our first decrease row. Now for the opposite pocket, you would extended single crochet across until the end, and then work 2 extended single crochet stitches together. So, but for this purpose, I'm just going to show you how the decreases work. So you'll either be skipping a stitch or working 2 extended single crochet stitches together. Okay, so we've made it to the end of that first decrease row, so you can see we kind of have that little slant here. So for the next row, we're going to chain one, oops, chain was a little too big, chain one and turn, and this time we're going to extended single crochet all the way across until 2 stitches remain. Okay, so we've got 2 stitches left, and we're going to work an extended single crochet 2 together in those last stitches. Okay, and then we chain one and turn, and we start that same process again. So just repeating those 2 rows back and forth, you'll start to see your decreases kind of making a diagonal line all the way up to the top of the pocket. And for the other pocket, it'll be on this side. It'll kind of go this way. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this pocket, and then I'll show you what it will look like, and I'll go through how to make the ribbing along that decrease edge. Okay, so here is our left side pocket. We have our main part done using the chenille peel, and now we are switching over to a 5mm hook and the basic stitch anti-pilling, which is color B. And we want to attach our yarn down here right at the beginning of the decreases. So we're just going to attach, chain one, we're going to single crochet in the same stitch as our join, and we're just going to single crochet evenly across this diagonal line where our decrease rows are. Again, this doesn't have to be super exact, but I'm working about 1 single crochet into each decrease row. until we get all the way to the top of our pocket. Okay, so now we're going to be working back and forth in ribbed rows right here. So without cutting off or anything, we're going to chain 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then working back along these chains, we're going to do a single crochet in the second chain from the hook and in each chain all the way down. Okay. Then we're going to slip stitch into the next 2 stitches along our decrease row. Okay, and then we turn. We're going to skip over those slip stitches and we're going to single crochet back loop only into each stitch across. So you have 5 single crochets in the back loop. Chain 1 and we turn. And we just repeat those 2 rows. So we're going to single crochet in the back loop only for 5. Sometimes that 5th one can be a little hard to get into. And then we're going to slip stitch into the next 2 stitches along that edge of our pocket. And then turn, skip the slip stitches, and work single crochets, back loop only, in each stitch across. Chain 1 and turn again, and you can see we're just adding this applied ribbing to our pocket, and we'll do that all the way down until we've gotten back down to where we started. So just continue doing that, and then you repeat that same thing on the other pocket, so the right hand pocket as well. So here's what we'll have once we're done with the pockets. Don't mind all my ends hanging out. I like to kind of use the long tails at the ends for seaming things in place and for sewing things. So this is the left pocket because it's going to be on the left hand side of the cardigan. And then just like the mirror image is the right pocket because it's going to go on the right side of the cardigan. So we're going to start with our right pocket, but the instructions are going to be basically the same. You're going to do the same steps for both pockets. So I'll just show you one. We're going to show you the right, and then you'll repeat the process on the opposite side. Okay, so your pocket might look a little funny. You might be thinking, what does this look like? Don't worry, we're going to sew the ribbing down. So since we used a larger hook for our ribbing, we're going to kind of fold it over and stitch it in place. And we're going to pull it over so that the end of our ribbing is going to line up with the edge of our pocket, especially when we sew it down. But what I also like to do before sewing it to the bomber jacket is we're just going to kind of stitch along here to sew it in place so it's not like popping up. So you should have a long tail wherever you finished your ribbing for your pocket. And actually I can just go ahead and take this stitch marker out. And then we're just going to grab a large tapestry needle and taking this long piece of yarn that was left from the ribbing, we're going to thread it on our needle. And then we want to fold it down in place. And something that I find useful are these little clips. They're like little sewing clips. You can get them on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description below, but they're just like cute little clips that are really good at holding things in place. So I'm going to kind of clip my ribbing down. So on that side, and then kind of clip it down where it will need to be on this side. Kind of make sure that it's all in line. I'm just going to clip it twice right here on the edge just to hold it down a little bit while we sew. Okay, so now what we can do is we're going to bring our yarn through the actual pocket part, so the chenille peel part, and kind of back up, and we're just going to sew along the edge here, kind of weaving in and out. So we're sewing the ribbing to the pocket, and sewing it down. This was the best way that I could get the ribbed edge on the pocket, and it kind of gives it a nice little curve along here, like a little curved edge instead of being so straight. So just kind of however you feel is best. Oops, here's one of the ends. If you want to like whip stitch it, you can, but I'm just kind of going in and out, making little stitches that'll be pretty invisible once it's all sewn in. And I'm using the long tail from the edge of the ribbing, so with color B. So just continue to sew your ribbing down to the pocket so that it will stay in place. So I'm just going to keep going all the way to the end here. All right, so now we have our pocket ribbing sewn down. We can remove our clips. It should stay nicely in place. And now we can attach it to our right side front panel. Okay, so we'll want to lay down our cardigan or our bomber jacket and line up. Here's the right side of our bomber, and we're going to be sewing it in place right along the bottom edge and the front edge. So kind of make sure it's laying properly. And then we're going to take our pocket and lay it right on top. And we want to be sewing right into this first row, right up against our ribbing here. And then eventually when we do our front edging, our collar, we'll be attaching it to the front here. So a nice thing, again, these clips will come in handy is holding it in place along this front edge. We can just clip it right to the front so we know that we're keeping it in place where it needs to be. Okay, and then doing our best to kind of keep it lined up and as flat as possible. So I'm going to use I left a long tail at the beginning of when I was making my pocket. I'm going to use the chenille peel, so color A, to sew it along the bottom ribbing here and up the edge. And then I'll use whatever's left of my basic stitch to kind of go through here again and make sure that this is nice and flat. So I'm using trying to use the same yarn of where I'm sewing. So let me grab my tapestry needle. And if you want, you can also use straight pins to pin it in place too. Can kind of get in here and slip a little needle in just to hold it in place for you as well. whichever method you prefer, whatever makes you feel most comfortable. Okay, so we're just going to thread the chenille yarn onto our tapestry needle. And then we can start sewing it in place. And again, I just like to pull it all the way through. Oops, it's getting stuck on my pin. The back side, just making sure I'm catching the pocket. It can be kind of hard to see with the chenille yarn, but I'm just going weaving back and forth from front to back to front, all along this bottom part of our pocket and right on top of right where the ribbing ends. This one I might do smaller stitches, like closer together than I did just sewing down the ribbing, since we're going to put our hands in there. We don't want anything falling out of our pocket at the end. So you can kind of double check, make sure everything is getting held down. If you need to go back and do some extra stitches, you can. Another option would be to pull it through and then kind of go around the bottom of the pocket and down into the back. So whichever method you prefer, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Luckily this yarn is pretty forgiving, so you won't really see the stitches when you're done. So just continue to sew your pocket on along this bottom edge, up the side, making sure that you're getting the ribbing in place. And then once that's in place, come up here to the top. And again, I'm using the tail end of my yarns to sew all the way along here. So sewing that in place. So this end here, we're just having clipped together. We will end up joining this once we are done with our collar and we're doing the front edges. Okay, and then you just repeat the same process with the left side of the bomber jacket as well. Okay, so here's what the pocket will look like once it is all sewn on and in place. So you can see, you can fit your hand in there and make sure that there's no little holes or anything, that everything is nice and secure. And then if you do use the clips, you can feel free to keep these attached until we're ready to do the edging here, but just go ahead and attach the second pocket in the same manner on the left hand side, and then I'll meet you back here later. As always, you can find links to the written pattern and the PDF pattern in my shop in the description below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe.